A gray jet, no bigger than a family saloon car, stretched into a dart, hangs in the sky where no fixed-wing aircraft has any business hanging. It is not diving, it is not climbing, it is simply hovering, nose up, exhaust nozzles rotated downward, engines screaming to hold 8 tons of British steel and fuel motionless above the freezing sea. Then, in a single fluid motion, the nozzles swivel back, the jet lunges forward, and the Sea Harrier FRS-1 accelerates into a combat air patrol that will, within days, become one of the most lopsided air campaigns in modern history. 9,000 kilometers to the northwest, on the Argentine mainland, ground crews are bombing up A-4 Skyhawks, sturdy, proven attack jets that have flown for the United States Navy, for Israel, for a dozen air forces around the world. On paper, this should not be a fair fight. The Skyhawk is faster in level flight. The task facing British pilots seems, at first glance, close to impossible. And yet, by the time the guns fall silent in June, not a single Sea Harrier will have been lost to an Argentine fighter in air-to-air combat, while Skyhawks and Mirages will fall from the sky again and again to a British jet many analysts had quietly written off before the war began. This is the story of how a strange, unloved little aeroplane, built for a war in Europe that never came, ended up eating Skyhawks over the South Atlantic. To understand why the Sea Harrier existed at all, you have to go back to the economics of the Royal Navy in the 1960s. Britain had for decades projected air power from large fleet carriers, but by 1966, the government of the day had canceled the planned new carrier, CVA-01, and set a course that would see the Royal Navy's big conventional carriers retired through the 1970s. The service faced a genuine crisis. How do you operate fast jets at sea without the enormous decks, catapults, and arrestor wires that a proper carrier demands? The answer that emerged was not really designed as an answer at all. Hawker Siddeley's P-1127 experimental aircraft and its production descendant, the Kestrel, had been exploring vertical and short takeoff and landing, VSTOL, using a single engine that could direct its thrust downward as well as backward. The RAF adopted the Harrier as a dispersed, close-support attack jet that needed no runway at all, merely a forest clearing or a stretch of motorway. The Navy, watching its carrier fleet disappear, looked at this odd machine and saw a lifeline. Could a navalized Harrier operate from small, through-deck cruisers, ships barely a third the size of a proper carrier, and still provide fighter cover for the fleet? Skeptics doubted it. A subsonic jet, roughly two-thirds the top speed of contemporary interceptors, armed with only 2 cannon pods and a handful of missile stations, seemed a poor substitute for a proper fleet fighter. Existing solutions, the Phantom, the Buccaneer, needed the very carriers Britain no longer had. The Sea Harrier was, in the eyes of many in Whitehall, a stopgap born of necessity rather than choice, and nobody expected it to be tested in a full-scale war within 2 years of entering service. The answer came from Kingston upon Thames, at Hawker Siddeley's design offices, later folded into British Aerospace, working with Rolls-Royce in Bristol on the engine that made the whole concept possible. That engine, the Pegasus, remains one of the most extraordinary pieces of engineering Britain has ever produced. Rather than pushing air out through a single fixed nozzle at the rear, the Pegasus splits its thrust into 4 rotating nozzles, 2 forward, 2 aft, each swiveling together through roughly 98 degrees. Point them backward and the aircraft flies conventionally. Rotate them downward and 8 tons of thrust, comparable to the combined pulling power of a dozen family cars, punches straight into the ground and lifts the jet vertically into the air. It is, in essence, a jet engine you can steer like a nozzle on a garden hose, only the hose is producing enough force to lift several tons of aircraft against gravity. The naval variant, the FRS-1, first flew in August 1978 and entered Royal Navy service in 1980. It weighed around 5,700 kilograms empty, stretched just over 14 meters nose to tail, and was powered by a single Pegasus Mark 104 engine, producing roughly 95 kilonewtons of thrust. Crucially, engineers at British Aerospace raised the cockpit and fitted the Blue Fox radar, a modest set by later standards, but enough to give the pilot genuine look-down capability at sea, something the RAF's land-based Harriers had never needed. Production numbers were always small by wartime standards. Fewer than 60 FRS-1s were built for the Fleet Air Arm, and exact contract figures for spares and attrition replacements remain scattered across defense records rather than published in a single tidy total. What truly transformed the aircraft's usefulness at sea was not the aircraft itself, but a curved ramp bolted to the bow of the deck, the ski jump, developed and trialed at RAE Bedford. Launching a heavily laden Harrier from a flat deck wasted enormous amounts of runway and fuel simply getting airborne. Angle that final stretch of deck upward by around 12 degrees, however, and the aircraft leaves the ship already climbing, converting forward speed into vertical lift the moment it leaves the bow. It sounds almost absurdly simple, a playground slide for multi-million-pound jets. But the effect was to let Sea Harriers take off carrying significantly more fuel and ordnance than they otherwise could have managed from decks a fraction of the length of a proper fleet carrier. If you're finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. It costs nothing, and it tells the channel more of this sort of history is worth making. By April 1982, 20 Sea Harriers of 800 and 801 Naval Air Squadrons were embarked on board HMS Hermes and HMS Invincible, sailing south as task force operations began following Argentina's invasion of the Falkland Islands. Ranged against them was an Argentine Air Force and naval aviation inventory that included around 60 A-4 Skyhawks, alongside Dassault Mirages and IAI Daggers, flying from mainland bases hundreds of kilometers from the islands at the very edge of their combat radius. Operationally, the difference that decided the campaign was not raw speed, but the IM-9L Sidewinder, an all-aspect infrared missile supplied by the United States that could be fired from almost any angle rather than only from directly behind a target. Combined with the Sea Harrier's exceptional agility, particularly its ability to use vectoring in forward flight, briefly angling the nozzles during a dogfight to tighten a turn no conventional jet could match, British pilots repeatedly outmaneuvered faster Argentine aircraft in close combat. On May 1st, Harriers engaged Mirages and a Canberra over the islands, and combat losses began mounting against the Argentine side almost immediately. Through May, accounts from pilots such as Commander Nigel Sharkey Ward describe running fights over Falkland Sound, the stretch of water British forces grimly nicknamed Bomb Alley, where Skyhawks pressed low-level attacks on the landing fleet at San Carlos, while Harriers waited overhead and dove in behind them. Argentine pilots, flying at the limit of their fuel and often without adequate fighter escort, found themselves ambushed again and again by an aircraft their own briefings had suggested would be slow and easy prey. The psychological toll on Argentine aircrew, forced to fly a grueling round trip from the mainland into contested airspace, is well documented in post-war interviews, even where precise loss figures for individual engagements remain disputed to this day. By the war's end, Harriers were credited with something in the region of 20 confirmed air-to-air kills, the great majority of them Skyhawks, Mirages, and Daggers, for the loss of not one Harrier in air-to-air combat, although several were lost to ground fire and accidents. It's worth being honest that some individual claims remain contested between British and Argentine records, and reconstructing the precise sequence of certain engagements from radar tapes and pilot testimony decades later is not always straightforward. Compare this with what West Germany or the wider NATO alliance had done with VSTOL concepts of their own. Germany's VJ-101 and VFW VAK-191B programs of the 1960s explored vertical takeoff jet fighters using multiple lift engines, but both were canceled well before reaching operational service, victims of cost, complexity, and the sheer difficulty of managing several separate engines in one small airframe. The American approach to this same problem, decades later, would eventually produce the Lockheed Martin F-35B. But in 1982, the United States Navy and Marine Corps operated their own Aviate Harriers, essentially the RAF's land-based design, without the naval radar or the Sidewinder integration that made the Sea Harrier so effective as a fleet interceptor. No other nation in 1982 possessed a genuine vertical takeoff naval fighter with airborne radar and all-aspect missiles ready for combat. Britain's stopgap solution, born from a cancelled carrier program, turned out to be years ahead of anything anyone else could field at sea. The material effect of this imbalance was profound. Every Skyhawk or Mirage shot down was an aircraft the Argentine Air Force could not replace easily given international arms embargoes already limiting its access to spares.